Welcome, wherever you are. Let the light dim and your breath settle into an easy rhythm. The noise of the day fades, and in its place, something quieter emerges. A low hum, a faint connection, the quiet rhythm of a company being built, not on stage, but behind the screen. Tonight, we begin a long, slow walk through the history of Spotify. You might know it now as the green icon on your phone, or the soft voice behind your favorite playlist. But long before it filled rooms and headphones around the world, Spotify was just an idea. And then, a cramped office in Stockholm. Then, a whiteboard, a blinking cursor, a cup of half-finished coffee beside a dim monitor. This isn't the story of billion-dollar exits or chart-topping hits. It's the story of what it was actually like to build the thing that now delivers so much sound in a place that for a time felt impossibly quiet. Before we begin, please like the video and subscribe before you fall asleep, but only if you really like the content I make. Also, write in the comments where you are from and when you are watching. It is so interesting to see where people are watching from around the world. Thank you. Our journey begins in Sweden. The year is 2006. Imagine yourself walking down a narrow Stockholm street in late autumn. The sky is low and colorless. The air carries the scent of wet concrete and early frost. You turn into a modest office space tucked above a wine shop, its sign barely visible behind fogged glass. This was the first home of Spotify, not yet a company with thousands of employees, not yet a streaming empire, just a few people, most of them young, with laptops open and headphones on. The office was quiet but intense, the kind of place where the servers hummed louder than the conversation. The floors creaked softly under worn carpeting. A whiteboard leaned crookedly against one wall, covered in looping marker lines. In one corner, a microwave blinked the wrong time. In another, a mini fridge hummed beside a couch that nobody really sat on. The atmosphere wasn't glamorous. It was cluttered, improvised, and cold in the mornings. In the early days, there was no working app, no music, no users, just the belief or the hope that music could someday stream as smoothly as water from a tap. That was the guiding metaphor. Daniel Ek, one of the co-founders, believed that accessing a song should be instant and frictionless. But in 2006, nothing about that was easy. Internet speeds were inconsistent, label rights were hard to obtain, and software bugs were constant companions. The early team worked in near silence, punctuated by low conversation and keyboard clatter. Many were friends or acquaintances of Ek and co-founder Martin Lorentzen, engineers, product thinkers, and interface designers with backgrounds in gaming, search engines, or advertising. Imagine being one of those first employees. You arrive late in the morning. The office is already warm with machines. You pour lukewarm coffee into a chipped mug, slide on your headphones, and sink into another long stretch of debugging playback latency. There's music, but it's all local files. They're testing how long it takes to begin playing, how to cache sound data invisibly. Spotify didn't stream music at first. It simulated the idea. In the early versions, songs were served up as if they were being streamed, even though they were preloaded. This allowed the team to focus on the user experience before they built the full backend. It was a cheat, but a clever one. Lunch might come from a plastic box or a nearby deli. Conversation drifted between Swedish and English. A debate might rise over compression codecs or how to handle licensing metadata. But always calmly, this was not a startup with loud slogans or beanbag chairs. There was a sense of focused pressure, the unspoken awareness that what they were trying to do was very difficult. Apple's iTunes was still dominant. Napster had come and gone. Piracy was still the default for many. And yet, Spotify aimed to bridge the gap. Free, legal, and instant. Outside, the world barely noticed inside. Developers tinkered with prototypes. Designers mocked up translucent interfaces. EK walked the office slowly, always thinking, always adjusting. Small things, lines of code, font weights, feedback loops. He was known for being meticulous, even a little obsessive, but not loud, not demanding, just present, watching, thinking. In the evenings, the office would dim slightly, lights off in the hallway. A faint echo of laughter from a nearby bar. Some stayed late. Others slipped quietly out into the night, their screens still glowing behind the windows. The product would not officially launch for 2 more years. But here, in this forgotten stretch of time, Spotify began to take shape, not as a brand or platform, but as a routine, as work, as a series of invisible choices made in the quiet. That's where we begin. Next, we turn our attention to Daniel Ek himself. Not the legend, not the CEO, but the young man at the center of the silence, pacing the length of a rented office, wondering if any of this would actually work. Now imagine the hum of a single laptop left open in the corner of that first Spotify office. The building has emptied for the evening. The street outside is quiet. The monitor glows softly, and Daniel Ek is still there. He rarely left early, even in the earliest days, before investors, before licensing, and before music filled the interface. EK moved deliberately through every part of the product, not just as a founder, but as someone intimately familiar with the code, the design, and the psychology behind what Spotify would eventually become. But Daniel Ek's journey began long before those dim Stockholm evenings. He was born in 1983 in Ragsford, a southern suburb of Stockholm, not a place known for glitz or excess, but rather for its rows of functional apartment buildings, its quiet working-class atmosphere. As a child, Daniel was shy and introspective. He liked computers early, teaching himself to code by the age of 13. By 14, he was running small web design gigs for local businesses, charging clients from his bedroom. Ek's adolescent years were not spent in clubs or concerts, but in front of a glowing screen, quietly building, not unlike the company he would one day create at 16. He applied for a job at Google, unsuccessfully of course, but not without trying. That same year, he began studying at the Royal Institute of Technology in Stockholm, majoring in engineering, though he dropped out before completing the program. Academia was too slow, too abstract. Ek wanted to build things now. His early ventures included a web hosting company and a digital advertising firm called Advertigo, which he eventually sold to trader Dubler, a deal that made him quietly wealthy. At just 23, for a brief moment, he considered stepping away from tech altogether. He bought a nice car, upgraded his apartment, and spent his days reading philosophy and wandering the city in thought. But something about the emptiness of early retirement didn't sit right with him. He wasn't drawn to money for its own sake. He missed the rhythm of problem solving, the comfort of routines, the challenge of systems that didn't quite work yet. And so, from that point of personal reflection, Daniel Ek began thinking about music. This was the mid-2000s. CD sales were collapsing. iTunes was winning over consumers, but not artists. Piracy was rampant, especially in Sweden, where services like the Pirate Bay had become household names. Ek had used it too, but not just to steal music. He studied it, watched its behaviors, thought about what people really wanted from their music experience. The key was not just legality or access, it was speed. Piracy won because it was faster than anything else, and so Spotify's central vision began to take form. A music platform, as fast and reliable as piracy, but clean, organized, and legal, free, or at least freemium. It would require users to sit through short ads, a compromise, but a small one, or subscribe for a monthly fee. Music would begin playing instantly, without loading bars or buffering icons. Just click and hear. But there was a problem. A very quiet, very complex problem. Spotify had no music to build a product like this. Ek needed the cooperation of the world's biggest record labels. Sony, Universal, EMI, Warner. These were large, slow-moving institutions, not known for taking risks, especially not with unknown Scandinavian startups. And yet, without their catalogs, the app was nothing more than a shell. The next phase of Ek's journey was not spent in Stockholm. It was spent in flights and waiting rooms, in coffee, shops and corridors, in meeting rooms that smelled of paper and filtered air. The licensing process was slow, bureaucratic, and often discouraging. Record label executives didn't always understand what Spotify was offering. Was it a download store? Was it a radio station? Why should they trust a 24-year-old from Sweden? He had to explain over and over that this was streaming, a word still unfamiliar to many in the industry at the time. Music would not be owned, but accessed, played, but never possessed. Ek's pitch was rational and patient. He emphasized security, control, and data. Record labels would have more transparency into listener behavior than they'd ever had before. Spotify could track every stream, every skip, every pause. This transparency was, eventually, persuasive, but not quickly. One by one, meetings turned into memorandums. Conversations turned into agreements. The first licensing deals were tentative and restricted, limited to certain countries and specific catalog portions. But they were enough, just enough, to begin. Back in Stockholm, Ek and his team prepared for launch. The first version of Spotify was invite-only, limited to a small number of users in Sweden. The interface was clean and quiet, modeled after familiar file-sharing programs, but stripped of chaos and clutter. It felt less like a store and more like a command center for your musical taste. You typed a song and it played nearly instantly. That was the hook. That was the promise. Behind the scenes, this required enormous technical complexity. Developed a hybrid system, part central server, part peer-to-peer network, to distribute music rapidly without overloading any one node. Engineers adjusted caching protocols. Designers tested user flows. EK walked between desks with a steady gaze, quietly absorbing the feedback, making tiny suggestions, shifting small levers of the interface. When Spotify launched officially in October of 2008, it was not a global moment. No headlines, no parades, just a small but growing user base, quietly delighted by how simple the platform was. Daniel Ek, by then, had begun to retreat slightly from the day-to-day interface work, focusing more on long-term strategy and partnerships. But his presence remained a constant. He dressed simply, he spoke quietly, and he listened more than he talked. Spotify would grow, slowly, country by country, deal by deal. But the foundational work, the code, the concept, the compromises, was already complete. And it had all happened, for the most part, out of sight, in quiet offices, in long emails, in subtle lines of code. In the next segment, we'll step inside the system itself, the black box at the heart of Spotify, the recommendation engine, the algorithm, the quiet machine that decides what you hear next, and why you might not even notice. Imagine, for a moment, that you're using Spotify late at night. You didn't plan what to play. You just opened the app, pressed something, and let the sound begin. Maybe it's soft acoustic guitar, maybe something instrumental. Whatever it is, it seems to understand your mood. You didn't tell it how you were feeling, but somehow it knew. That sense, the eerie accuracy, the calm flow from one track to the next, isn't random. It's the result of something has been building, layer by layer, for years. A system of quiet decisions and silent math. The algorithm. But the algorithm is a bit of a myth. Spotify doesn't use just one system. It uses many, interconnected and constantly evolving. Behind every playlist suggestion, every Discover weekly track, every auto-generated radio station, there are dozens of signals at work, but none of it is loud. None of it draws attention to itself. Spotify's goal has always been invisibility. The interface fades. The recommendations appear. The music just plays. To understand how this came to be, we have to go back to a small, internal team within the company around 2012. By this point, Spotify had launched in several countries. Millions of tracks were available, but users were overwhelmed. Searching for a specific song was easy. Discovering something new that felt like magic was harder. Spotify knew that music taste wasn't fixed. It drifted slowly, shaped by mood, time, and place. People wanted to be surprised, but not too much. They wanted to explore, but only just outside their comfort zone. So the question became, how do you recommend the right song at the right time without ever asking? The team's solution began with metadata. Every track on Spotify carries invisible tags: artist, genre, tempo, duration, key. Some of this data is provided by the labels. Some is scraped or inferred. Over time, Spotify's systems began to learn the relationships between these tags, how songs connected to each other in a web of hidden similarity. But metadata wasn't enough. The next step was user behavior. Spotify tracks, quietly and respectfully, how you use the app, not just what you play, but how long you play it, what you skip, what you repeat, what you save to a playlist, even the time of day you listen to certain types of music. These subtle patterns feed into machine learning systems, mathematical models trained to notice trends and generate predictions. If you listen to quiet piano at 10 p.m. every weeknight, Spotify learns that. If you play upbeat indie rock on Saturday mornings, it remembers, but not in a personal way. It doesn't store your name next to that pattern. It simply adjusts your recommendations, softly, invisibly. The real breakthrough came with the launch of Discover Weekly in 2015. This was a new kind of playlist. It appeared once a week, every Monday, with 30 songs the algorithm believed you hadn't heard, but would probably like. It wasn't perfect, but it was shockingly good. The experience felt intimate, even a little uncanny, as if someone had been quietly studying your musical soul internally. Spotify had built this using a blend of collaborative filtering, noticing users with similar tastes and borrowing their favorites. Natural language processing, scanning blogs and reviews for cultural signals, and raw acoustic analysis, examining the waveform and structure of each track. Together, these systems formed a kind of musical intuition, not emotional, not human, but strangely effective. One engineer described it as building a friend who only talks in songs. Over time, Spotify expanded this system. Release. Radar was added, a weekly playlist of new tracks from artists you follow. Daily mixes emerged, softly themed blends of genres you often explore. None of these required input from you. You didn't have to build anything. You simply opened the app, and the options were there. Quiet, curated, and convenient. But not everyone understood how it worked. Even within Spotify, the exact logic of every recommendation isn't always clear. Machine learning models are probabilistic. They observe patterns, not intentions. They don't know why you like what you like. They simply notice that you do. And this led to a strange cultural shift, one that unfolded quietly over the late 2010s. As more users relied on Spotify, algorithmic suggestions, traditional ways of discovering music began to fade. Fewer people browsed by genre, fewer followed music blogs, even fewer knew the names of new artists. Only the voices, the sounds, the mood the playlist evoked. Spotify didn't set out to erase musical context, but the convenience of passive discovery made it easy to let go of choice, to let the system decide. And for many, that was a welcome trade-off. Music became something that found you, not something you found. Inside Spotify, this shift was carefully watched. Teams debated how to balance automation with agency. Some worried about echo chambers, users being fed more of what they already liked, never venturing outside their tastes. Others saw opportunity, the chance to introduce people to unfamiliar artists, cultures, or languages in a non-threatening way. So Spotify began building in quiet nudges. Some playlists, like Fresh Finds, were seeded with artists far outside your usual orbit. Some recommendations were chosen not for safety, but for subtle friction, the musical equivalent of a gentle prod, saying, "Try this." And all of this happened beneath the surface. No alerts, no announcements, just a subtle shift in what your ears encountered. The algorithm never speaks. It only listens. It observes. And then it suggests. By 2020, Spotify was no longer just a music platform. It had become a context engine, shaping moments, moods, and memories for millions of users without demanding their attention. It worked best when no one thought about it at all. In the next and final segment, we'll move from the interface to the impact, not what Spotify does for listeners, but what it means for the artists, the labels, and the quiet economic structures that support the sound. Picture a small apartment in Manchester. The walls are covered in blankets for soundproofing. A second-hand microphone sits balanced between two stacks of books. A young musician, perhaps in their 20s, leans over a laptop. They're adjusting levels, checking waveforms, uploading a new track. It will go live on Spotify in a few hours, and with it comes a quiet hope, not for fame necessarily, but for something more modest. Plays listeners. Maybe a playlist slot. Maybe, eventually, enough to buy time for another song. Spotify is free to use, but it is not free to build for. On the other side of every stream is a long chain of economic realities, publishing rights, digital distribution platforms, licensing, percentages, and somewhere near the end of that chain sits the artist. In the beginning, Spotify's royalty system was relatively straightforward. It paid rights holders based on a pro rata model. This meant that each month, Spotify would pool all subscription and ad revenue together, then divide it based on how many times each track had been played across the platform. So if a song made up 1% of all streams in a month, its rights holders received 1% of that month's payout. But this system had consequences. It meant that the most popular tracks, global hits, played millions of times, absorbed a large share of the money, even from users who never listened to them. Smaller, niche artists might have loyal fans, but those fans' subscription fees were still being divided among the chart-toppers. Spotify did not invent this model. It was inherited from the record industry, a structure designed to handle physical distribution and radio play. But within the streaming context, its effects became more visible, more quietly uneven. Some countries experimented with alternatives. In France and Finland, studies explored a user-centric model, where each subscriber's fee would be divided only among the artists they listened to. Supporters of this model argued that it would more fairly reward independent and musicians, but labels were hesitant. The transition would be complex, and the outcomes uncertain. Spotify, meanwhile, walked a delicate line. It had to keep artists satisfied enough to keep uploading, while maintaining strong relationships with the major labels who owned the bulk of the catalogs. Labels, in turn, controlled the rights, and most often they collected the bulk of the payouts before passing them on to artists. For the average listener, none of this was visible. A song played, a playlist shuffled, but beneath the surface, the economics were shifting. The streaming era de-emphasized purchases. Musicians who once earned from physical album sales or digital downloads now received fractions of a cent per stream. Some adapted artists began to focus on quantity, releasing more singles, more often, to maintain algorithmic visibility. Others leaned into the platform's tools: Spotify for artists' dashboards, promotional playlists, audience analytics. A few hired teams just to understand what time of day to release music for optimal engagement. Live performance, already essential for income, became even more central. Merch sales and touring remained among the few reliable revenue sources. Spotify could offer exposure, wide, steady exposure, but not always sustenance. In response to growing tension, Spotify introduced programs like Spotify Wrapped, which gave artists and fans an annual look at listening statistics. These were more than data points. They became social moments, shared screenshots, a quiet kind of celebration. Listeners felt involved. Artists felt seen, at least for a few days. Other tools followed: Canvas, the short looping video behind songs; Marquee, a promotional boost system; Playlist, pitching portals; podcast integration, all part of evolving approach to creator engagement. But behind the new features, the core economic reality persisted. Spotify was a tech platform first, a music distributor second. It did not sign artists. It did not own labels. It provided the structure. And in that structure, some voices echoed more loudly than others. Independent musicians found niches. Ambient composers, lo-fi producers, experimental sound artists, all flourished in the long tail of algorithmic discovery. Their music fit the mood-driven playlists Spotify favored: sleep, focus, deep work, evening chill. These were not charts. They were environments. And in that environment, quiet music often did well. But traditional genres, Rock bands, singer-songwriters, classical ensembles sometimes struggled to find the same traction. Their work did not always fit neatly into background listening. Their audiences, often loyal, were not always large. So the life of a musician in the Spotify age became one of constant adjustment. Touring, yes. Merch, yes. But also metadata, accuracy, playlist strategy, follower growth. Some resisted, others adapted. A few, quietly, withdrew. In 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic paused live performance globally. For many artists, this was a turning point. Streaming remained, but it could not replace the energy or economics of the stage. Spotify responded with fundraising tools, direct donation links, and more creator support programs. But the cracks in the system had become more visible. Yet even through these challenges, Spotify continued to grow. It was not the cause of every difficulty, but it was the stage on which those difficulties now played out. It had become the default, the stream through which music flowed. For most listeners, that was enough. But for those who made the music, the experience was more complex, sometimes frustrating, sometimes empowering, always evolving. In the next chapter, we'll shift focus, not to artists or listeners, but to Spotify itself, its offices, its internal culture. The strange contrast between a quiet app and a fast-moving company that changed how the world listens. Picture an open-plan office in downtown Stockholm. Wide windows overlook a quiet street. The floors are polished wood. There are whiteboards filled with markers, and sleek desks spaced just far enough apart to feel modern but not cold. This is one of Spotify's main headquarters, and by now, the company has changed. The year is around 2013. The platform is no longer a scrappy startup. It has over 20 million users globally, and its team has grown from a small room above a wine shop to hundreds of engineers, designers, lawyers, marketers, and product managers spread across Europe and the United States. But inside Spotify, something interesting has happened. Despite its scale, the company has tried to hold on to the feeling of its early days, not with slogans or beanbag chairs, but through structure. A structure that Daniel Ek believed could keep the company nimble and experimental, even as it expanded across time zones. The answer was something Spotify called the squad model. This model wasn't unique to Spotify, but it became famous because of them. At its core, it broke the company down into small, autonomous teams, squads, each responsible for a specific part of the product. There were squads for search, squads for playlists, squads for artist tools. Each team operated almost like its own startup within the company, with a product owner, designers, and engineers all embedded together. Imagine yourself working in one of these squads. You arrive around 9:30 in the morning. The office is calm but busy. People are gathered in soft conversations near coffee machines. You sit with your team at a shared workspace. The morning begins with a short stand-up meeting, 10 minutes to review what was done yesterday and what's being worked on now. You're part of the squad that manages mobile playback. Your current task is to reduce the delay between pressing play and hearing sound. It's a small issue, the difference between 600 milliseconds and 500 milliseconds. But in Spotify's world, that matters. The autonomy is real. Your squad doesn't need permission from top executives to experiment with a new solution. You deploy internally, test quietly, iterate based on feedback. There are mistakes. Sometimes, ideas don't work, but failure is part of the system. The squad model allowed Spotify to move quickly, even as it became massive. But it also had side effects. With so many independent teams, communication could be uneven. One squad might release a feature that conflicted with another's work. Coordination required effort. Managers were often less visible. There was freedom, but also occasional friction. Spotify worked to keep its culture soft-pitched office. Decor was modern but warm. Common areas included quiet spaces for reflection. Music played in communal areas, curated by employees. And while some teams worked intensely, there was a strong emphasis on balance. Spotify offered its employees generous parental leave, wellness stipends, and an openness to remote work long before it became industry standard. It wasn't just about productivity, it was about rhythm. A kind of corporate tempo, designed not to burn out but to sustain. But underneath the calm, Spotify was also preparing for something big. By 2015, conversations about an initial public offering had begun. Spotify had raised hundreds of millions in venture capital. It had opened offices in New York, London, Berlin, Boston, and yet it had never turned a consistent profit. Growth was rapid, but expectations were mounting, and growth came with complexity. As Spotify entered more countries, it had to comply with more local laws, privacy regulations, content standards, advertising norms. Its legal teams expanded. Its content moderation systems became more sophisticated. Its product features had to support more languages, more currencies, more cultural expectations. Internally, the company still felt young, but outside, it was being treated like a tech giant. Spotify began to attract more scrutiny, not just from the press, but from regulators, competitors, and the music industry itself. To stay ahead, Spotify evolved its strategy. It launched Spotify for Artists, a dashboard giving musicians access to listener data. It partnered with hardware manufacturers, integrating into smart speakers, gaming consoles, and in-car systems. It began investing heavily in machine learning and back-end infrastructure. The culture inside the company shifted subtly, but noticeably, there were more meetings, more planning documents, more levels of approval. It was no longer enough to just build something cool. It had to fit the roadmap. The product had to support the business, not just the experience. Some employees missed the old days, the quiet mornings, the scrappy energy, the freedom to experiment. Others welcomed the maturity, the scale, the stability. Spotify was now a global brand. Its logo, the green circle with the curved waves, had become familiar from billboards, TV commercials, and phone screens worldwide. And yet, in many ways, the app remained the same. You opened it, you searched, or you didn't. You played something, and music flowed. Behind that simple experience was a company constantly in motion, balancing creativity with commerce, innovation with stability, speed with scale. In the next part of our journey, we'll explore Spotify's moment of public transformation, the unusual way it entered the stock market, and what it revealed about a company that had always done things a little differently. It's early April 2018. The streets of New York hum with their usual weekday rhythm. Skyscrapers cast long shadows across sidewalks, and inside the New York Stock Exchange, traders mill about under bright screens and digital tickers. But something is different today. There are no balloons, no streamers, no brass bell ceremony, because today Spotify is going public. And, characteristically, it is doing it differently. Rather than using a traditional initial public offering, an IPO, Spotify chose a direct listing. This meant that the company wasn't issuing new shares. It wasn't raising capital. Instead, existing shareholders, employees, investors, founders could simply begin selling their shares on the open market. There were no underwriters setting a price, no banks managing allocations, just a quiet entry into the public eye. The decision was strategic and also philosophical. Daniel Ek, still CEO, published a letter that morning. In it, he explained that Spotify had never been a normal kind of company, and it wasn't interested in doing a normal kind of IPO. The direct listing allowed Spotify to remain in control of its narrative, to signal that it was stable, self-sustaining, and not in need of a cash injection. It was also, in many ways, a reflection of the company's broader identity: steady, subdued, and quietly confident. Back in Stockholm and New York, employees watched the public debut. From their offices, not with champagne, but with cautious curiosity. The stock began trading around $165 per share, giving the company an initial valuation of nearly $30 billion. It was a surreal moment for many early employees. Some had joined when Spotify was little more than a prototype. Now their stock options were real. Their work, all those silent bug fixes, back-end rebuilds, and interface tweaks, was part of a global enterprise. But going public also changed the tempo. Spotify now had to report quarterly earnings. It had to answer to investors, to analysts, to the financial press. Its decisions, once guided mainly by product vision, were now judged against growth curves and profitability projections. In the short term, Spotify's user base continued to grow. Monthly active users climbed. Premium subscribers ticked steadily upward. New markets opened: India, the Middle East, parts of Africa. The app remained consistent, elegant, reliable. But Spotify wasn't just growing, it was also shifting around. This time, a new content type began to take root inside the platform. Podcasts. Spotify had always been about music. But internally, executives saw an opportunity. Podcasts were growing in popularity, especially among younger listeners. They offered high engagement, low licensing costs, and strong retention. And, unlike music, Spotify could own them outright. So, in 2019, Spotify made a series of bold, quiet moves. It acquired Gimlet Media, a podcast production company. It bought Anchor, a platform for podcast creation and distribution. And later, it purchased Parcast and The Ringer. These weren't just investments. They were signals. Spotify was becoming a hybrid, not just a streaming service, but a platform for spoken audio. The tone inside the company shifted once more. Engineering teams expanded their focus. Designers adjusted the app interface to highlight podcast content. Recommendation systems were retrained to handle not just songs, but episodes, shows, voices. New users might open Spotify, not for music, but for conversation. And then came the most high-profile partnership of all. In May 2020, Spotify announced an exclusive licensing deal with the Joe Rogan Experience, one of the world's most downloaded podcasts. The deal, reportedly worth over $100 million, brought both acclaim and controversy. Rogan's podcast was known for long, meandering interviews, sometimes provocative, sometimes controversial. By making it exclusive, Spotify signaled that it was not just a distributor, but a gatekeeper. It controlled access. It could shape what its users heard and what they didn't. Inside the company, this raised quiet questions. What was Spotify now? A music app? A media company? A publisher? The answers were unclear, and for the most part, Spotify stayed silent. Its leadership spoke rarely and carefully. Its platform evolved slowly, but under the surface, the transformation was accelerating. In 2021, Spotify launched Green Room, a live audio feature. It experimented with paid podcast subscriptions, interactive tools, and real-time listener data. It began funding original shows and courting major voices across politics, culture, and entertainment. Investors watched with interest. So did artists. Some welcomed the expansion. Others worried that music was being sidelined. But the data suggested otherwise. Users who listened to podcasts still listened to music. In fact, they often listened more. Spotify's bet was that users wanted a sound environment, one app, one place, for all their audio needs. And so it continued its careful rebalancing act, part tech platform, part studio, part discovery engine. Back in Stockholm, many things remained unchanged. The coffee machines still buzzed softly in the morning. Whiteboards filled with quiet diagrams. Squads planned their sprints. Engineers shipped updates no one noticed. The rhythm, though broader, still pulsed gently forward. Spotify had gone public, and public meant visible. But the heart of the company still beat in low tones. Always building, always adjusting. In our next chapter, we'll move through most recent years, the pandemic, the shifting content landscape, the economic headwinds, and how a company built on quiet design faced a world that suddenly became very loud. Imagine the streets empty, cafes closed, offices dark, cities around the world, once full of noise and rhythm, fell into a strange kind of stillness. It was the spring of 2020, and the COVID-19 pandemic had swept across the globe, whose existence relied on the gentle assumption that people had routines, commutes, workouts, parties, idle moments between tasks. The sudden halt of daily life was more than a cultural disruption. It was a data disruption, because Spotify had always been a company that followed patterns. It knew, for example, that morning rush hours saw sharp increases in podcast starts, that workout playlists surged just before dinner time, that Friday evenings leaned toward upbeat pop, that Sunday mornings saw a rise in jazz and acoustic guitar. Now, those signals vanished almost overnight. As millions of people stayed home, Spotify's algorithms began to see new behaviors. There was less movement, less daytime variation, more late-night listening, more ambient instrumental, focus-based playlists. Sleep music became more popular. White noise, lo-fi beats, soothing sounds, capes. Behind the scenes, Spotify's teams had to adjust, not by redesigning the app, but by understanding how to interpret this new silence. What does recommendation mean when no one is going anywhere? So they listened, not just to the data, but to users. New playlists appeared, work from home, at home with kids, daily wellness, virtual dinner party, each. One curated not to excite, but to accompany, to support a different kind of day. In Sweden, where Spotify's cultural roots remain strong, the office emptied too. Engineers worked from home, tuning back-end systems from spare bedrooms and kitchen. Tables, weekly meetings shifted to video calls. The squad model, built for autonomy, helped the company stay nimble, even from afar. Meanwhile, Another part of Spotify's world was facing greater tension: the musicians, for artists. The pandemic was more than strange. It was devastating. Tours were cancelled, venues closed, merchandise sales dropped. Many artists relied on live performance for the bulk of their income, and suddenly, that entire infrastructure was gone. Streaming remained, but, as ever, it paid little per play. Spotify acknowledged this. In April 2020, it launched a feature allowing artists to add artist fundraising pick buttons to their profiles, links to PayPal, GoFundMe, and other platforms where fans could offer direct financial support. It wasn't a fix, but it was something. A quiet gesture in a time of deep uncertainty. And through it all, Spotify grew. Even as the world paused, the app found new purpose. People sought out familiar voices. Nostalgic playlists rose in popularity. 80s hits, 90s throwbacks, early 2000s People weren't just listening for entertainment. They were listening for memory. Podcasts expanded too dramatically. With everyone at home, podcast creation surged. Anchor, Spotify's podcast platform, saw thousands of new shows launched. Each day, some were professional, many were casual. Friends talking, families recording stories, teachers reading bedtime books for students. Spotify responded by improving its creation tools. It offered better analytics, editing features, and distribution support. And it continued its high-level acquisitions, bringing more studios and high-profile creators under its umbrella. In 2021, the company unveiled Spotify Hi-Fi, a promised rollout of CD quality streaming for premium users. The announcement was received warmly, though the feature would be delayed repeatedly, more visibly. Spotify doubled down on exclusive content. The Joe Rogan deal had positioned Spotify as a central platform for cultural conversation and sometimes controversy. Episodes that addressed public health, politics, and misinformation drew sharp criticism. Some artists, including Neil Young, publicly pulled their music from Spotify in protest. Internally, the company faced a difficult balance. It wanted to support free expression, but also public responsibility. Its moderation systems, designed originally for music metadata, now had to evaluate long-form speech, nuance, and tone. Spotify began adding content advisories to certain podcast episodes. It published content guidelines. It increased its investment in moderation teams. But the line remained blurry. Spotify was not a traditional publisher, yet it now hosted and promoted content that influenced millions. It didn't control what artists said, but it paid to platform them. The company stayed largely quiet, relying on carefully worded statements and continued platform adjustments. Meanwhile, users kept listening. By 2022, Spotify had over 400 million active users and more than 180 million premium subscribers. It had launched in more than 180 markets. Its library included over 80 million tracks and millions of podcast episodes. And yet, the app itself still looked simple. Still green, still black, still the same play button. The difference now was scale. Every design choice affected hundreds of millions. Every back-end tweak rippled across the world. Spotify's influence was no longer just technological. It was cultural, behavioral. Social. Music didn't just flow through Spotify. Listening habits were shaped by it. In the next part of our story, we'll explore how Spotify began to lean into interactivity, personalization, and even artificial intelligence. Not just choosing what you hear, but how you experience it, and what that experience might quietly say about you. It is early December. Perhaps you open the app first thing in the morning, still wrapped in your blanket, the light grey outside, the season slowing everything down. There's a notification waiting for you. Your Spotify Wrapped is here. You press it. The screen brightens. Music plays. And the numbers begin to scroll. Your most listened to song. Your top artists. Your genre breakdown. The number of minutes you spent listening this year. It feels oddly personal, even a little emotional, and quietly Spotify has just turned your year into a story. This annual ritual, Spotify Wrapped, is now a familiar part of the digital calendar. But it didn't begin with such fanfare. The earliest version, launched in 2015, was a simple microsite offering statistics. The experience was bare. The audience was niche. But over time, Spotify noticed something subtle. Users liked seeing their data, not just in charts or tables, but in narrative. Spotify Wrapped began to evolve from a simple stats sheet into a colorful, dynamic, shareable series of slides. Each one designed not just to inform, but to surprise, to spark memory, and most of all, to be shared. By 2019, it had become a cultural phenomenon. Social media platforms filled with screenshots of Wrapped results. Friends compared their top artists. Memes emerged around guilty pleasure tracks. And for many, Wrapped offered something strange and comforting. A record of how they spent their year, in sound. But behind the pastel colors and playful copywriting was something quietly powerful. Data storytelling. Spotify had always collected listening data for recommendations, for analytics, for back-end tuning. Wrapped transformed that data into identity, not in a broad demographic sense, but in a softer, more emotional one. It told you not just what you listened to, but who you were. You are someone who plays the same song 30 times in a row. Someone who prefers acoustic piano in winter and fast beats in summer. Someone who wakes up with jazz and falls asleep to rain sounds. Wrapped showed your patterns and made them feel meaningful. Inside Spotify, the team responsible for Wrapped treated it as a kind of annual gift. They worked quietly throughout the year, tweaking the design, testing new story formats, brainstorming ways to keep it fresh while preserving the ritual. And the success of Wrapped leads Spotify to think more deeply about personalization, because behind every track play is context. Where are you? What time is it? What mood are you in? Spotify couldn't ask those questions directly, but it could infer. Over years of passive observation, Spotify's algorithms began to understand the rhythms of individual lives. Some people start their day with soundtracks. Others prefer spoken word. Some fall into genre patterns. Others jump constantly. Spotify didn't judge. It simply adjusted. This personalization extended into made-for-you playlists, daily mixes, release radar, discover, weekly. It extended into editorial content, blends of algorithmic recommendations and human curation designed for mood, not genre. And it extended into subtle nudges, recommendations that appeared when you finished a playlist, soft suggestions, seeded between familiar favorites. Personalization wasn't just about better recommendations. It was about comfort. Imagine a long commute, a rainy day, a quiet room. You open the app, and somehow the first thing you see or hear is exactly what you didn't know you needed. That sense of recognition, of intimacy, is what was quietly building toward. And yet, this personalization had limits. Some critics noted that Spotify's approach, while comforting, could encourage passivity. If every recommendation is based on past behavior, how do you grow? If your musical world is shaped by feedback loops, do you ever escape your own taste? Spotify's engineers were aware of this, and so they built in subtle tools to challenge users' genre mixes, global hits, occasional outlier tracks, designed to expand your listening without overwhelming you. They called it exploration with training wheels. They also introduced blends, personalized shared playlists between two users, merging their listening histories into a single track list. It was another kind of intimacy, algorithmically mediated friendship. In 2023, Spotify introduced AI DJ, a feature that used generative voice technology and real-time recommendations to create a kind of virtual radio host. The DJ greeted you by name, commented on your listening trends, and played selections based on time of day, weather, and recent favorites. It wasn't just an assistant. It was a companion. The voice, calm, neutral, warm, was designed to feel present, but not intrusive. It marked a shift in Spotify's ambition, not just to be a platform, but a presence in your day. Something between background and company, between silence and conversation. All of this pointed toward a deeper question. What is Spotify becoming? Not just a music service, not just a podcast hub, but a layer, soft, invisible, personalized, that accompanies you through life's rhythms. In the next segment, we'll explore how Spotify has continued to evolve its role in the modern world as a tastemaker, a media gatekeeper, and a quiet architect of global sound. Imagine opening Spotify and scrolling past the familiar tabs, home, search, your library, but your eyes settle instead on something soft-colored, easy to overlook. A playlist curated just for you, or so it feels. Its title reads simply, Today's Top Hits. You've seen it before, maybe you've played it before, but have you ever wondered what it means to be on it? Because this playlist, a soft blue square with 30 to 50 tracks, is one of the most influential cultural spaces in the world. It's not a magazine, not a radio station, not a chart in the traditional sense, yet to be featured on today's top hits can propel an artist into millions of ears in a single day. And Spotify has dozens more like it: rap caviar, hot country, R&B, mint, Viva Latino, Hockey. Each genre or region has its own ecosystem of editorial playlists, some updated weekly, others daily. This is where Spotify shifted, quietly but powerfully, from being a platform to being a curator. In the era of CDs and iTunes, taste was shaped by labels, magazines, radio DJs. Then came the early algorithm-driven platforms, Pandora, Last.fm, which offered personalization but lacked depth of catalog. Spotify bridged both worlds. On one hand, it offered personalized playlists, Discover Weekly, created by algorithms based on your listening behavior. On the other hand, it also offered editorial playlists, created by teams of human curators across the globe. These curators are not famous. Most work anonymously, behind usernames and brand banners. But their choices, what songs to feature, in what order, with what frequency, shape the careers of musicians. Sometimes subtly, sometimes dramatically. For new artists, being featured on a prominent playlist can result in tens or hundreds of thousands of streams overnight. In some cases, it leads to record deals, media coverage, and sold-out shows. For more established acts, It helps maintain relevance, a steady presence in the ever-churning world of streaming. Inside Spotify, the curation process is methodical. Each genre team monitors new releases, listener feedback, label pitches, and performance data. Curators listen to hundreds of tracks weekly, sorting them not just by quality, but by fit, the elusive sense of whether a song belongs in a certain sonic space. Playlists have personalities. Songs to sing in the car leans upbeat, nostalgic, often cross-genre. Mood booster favors cheerful tempos and warm production. Sad indie embraces introspection, slow builds, and emotional textures. These are not genres, they are feelings. And Spotify has quietly become the cartographer of that emotional map. As the company grew, it began to invest more heavily in localization. Each country, each culture, received its own editorial footprint. In India, you might find Desi hits. In Japan, Tokyo super hits. In Nigeria, Afrobeats hits. In Brazil, Top Brazil. These playlists didn't just reflect local tastes, they shaped them, elevating regional stars, amplifying crossover trends, and slowly globalizing once isolated sounds. And with each playlist, Spotify gathered data, not just on who was listening, but how they were reacting. Skip rates, replays, playlist saves. These metrics fed back into the system, influencing future placements and promotions. But as the influence of playlists grew, so did the questions. Some critics noted that the system was opaque. How were songs chosen? Were labels exerting undue influence? Did artists without major label backing stand a chance? Spotify maintained that editorial decisions were made independently, but the process by design remained partly mysterious. To address some of these concerns, Spotify introduced tools for transparency. Spotify for Artists allowed musicians to submit unreleased tracks for playlist consideration. The submission form collected metadata, genre, mood, instrumentation, language, helping curators and algorithms identify suitable placements. Yet, even with this system, the competition was immense. Tens of thousands of new tracks are uploaded to Spotify each day. Most will never make it onto a major playlist. Many will barely be heard outside an artist's immediate circle. The long tail of music, vast, rich, and largely invisible, continues to grow. Spotify's role then became one of quiet balance between algorithms and human ears, between global taste and local scenes, between editorial authority and listener freedom. And in this balance, new forms of stardom emerged. Take bedroom pop, for instance, a microgenre that rose in the late 2010s. Driven by artists recording at home with simple tools, often uploading directly to Spotify. Soft vocals, intimate lyrics, lo-fi textures. These songs didn't climb the charts, they floated through playlists, slowly, gently, comfortably. Or consider the rise of international pop, Latin trap, K-pop, Afrobeats. These sounds, once regionally confined, found new audiences through curated playlists and algorithmic bridges. A K-pop fan in Mexico might be recommended a Nigerian R&B track. A reggaeton listener in Germany might stumble onto Tamil hip-hop. Taste became porous. The world got smaller. Spotify didn't force these changes. It created the environment in which they happened. A stream is not just a song. It is a moment, a mood, a signal. And in reading those signals calmly, continuously, Spotify shaped a quiet revolution in how we listen. In the next part of our journey, We'll look at how Spotify is beginning to prepare for its next frontier, not just sound, but interactivity, language, and the boundaries between creator and listener. As the 2020s unfolded, a quiet shift began to take shape inside Spotify's product roadmap. The app, once focused purely on playback, pressing play, pressing pause, started to feel more like a space for presence. A place not just to consume audio, but to engage with it. And so, Spotify turned its attention to something that had always been a part of sound, but had rarely been part of music. Platforms, conversation. This wasn't a sudden pivot. It began with podcasts, of course, an effort to broaden Spotify's scope beyond music. But with that came a realization. Podcasts opened the door to spoken interaction, longer form, dynamic, emotionally varied. And within that new shape of audio, there was room for something else. Not just listening, but speaking. So Spotify began experimenting. First with voice search, allowing users to speak their queries rather than type them. Simple, frictionless. Then, more ambitiously, it acquired a small startup called Betty Labs, the team behind Locker Room, a live audio platform. This move led to the launch of Spotify Green Room in 2021, a live audio app where users could join or host conversations similar to Clubhouse or Twitter Spaces. You could listen to a sports talk, a music review, or just casual dialogue among strangers. The rooms were ephemeral. There were no recordings, just the sound of presence. Green Room marked a departure from Spotify's usual structure. Unlike playlists or podcasts, which are produced, edited, and often curated, Green Room was live and unpredictable. For a company known for control, precise recommendations, tight product design, this was something new. But it didn't last long. By late 2022, Spotify quietly rebranded Green Room as Spotify Live, integrating it more directly into the main app. Yet even then, the focus remained uncertain. While the concept of live audio had attracted attention during the early months of the pandemic, user engagement waned as routines returned and the novelty faded. Internally, the question lingered. How do people want to interact with audio? Spotify's answer wasn't to abandon voice, but to refine it. One major experiment came in the form of the AI DJ, launched in 2023. Unlike Green Room, the DJ wasn't live or social. It was personal, a generative voice, modeled on real speech, that commented on your listening habits and queued up tracks with conversational flourishes. The DJ would say things like, "Here's a few tracks you loved back in the spring, bringing those vibes back," or "You've been listening to a lot of mellow stuff lately. Let's switch it up a bit." The tone was calm, the pacing slow. No drama, no flash. Just enough warmth to feel present, without demanding too much attention. In many ways, this feature echoed Spotify's core philosophy: low friction, high familiarity, and users responded. The AI DJ felt like a companion, not a human, not a robot, but something in between. It remembered you. It knew your taste. And it adjusted in real time, creating a kind of quiet dynamic between listener and guide. Behind the scenes, this feature drew on several technologies: natural language processing, machine learning, generative voice synthesis, and streaming behavior modeling. But to the user, it just felt like someone or something who understood you. This wasn't the only area where interactivity deepened. Spotify had also begun exploring interactive podcast features, polls, Q&As, multi-part episodes, with branching narratives. Some creators experimented with immersive storytelling formats, where the listener could choose what happened next. These were small experiments, quietly released. But they reflected a larger curiosity within the company, because Spotify's original model, you listen, we recommend, was slowly shifting toward U-shape, we respond. Part of this was driven by competition. TikTok's discovery model, YouTube's creator economy, and even smart speaker ecosystems showed that users were growing more comfortable speaking to machines, shaping content flows, and expecting feedback. Spotify couldn't become a video platform, but it could become a conversation platform, not one filled with noise or arguments, but with options, nudges, suggestions, places where voice, mood, and interaction quietly meet. One experiment, still in development, aimed to allow artists to record short voice messages, greetings, intros, stories behind the songs directly into albums and playlists. Imagine hearing a track, then a soft voice from the artist. I wrote this song during a winter in Oslo. The snow was heavy that week. Not necessary, but intimate, quiet, personal. As always, Spotify moved carefully. These features were opt-in. The design was minimal. The goal was not to distract, but to deepen. Spotify wasn't trying to become social in the traditional sense. It wasn't chasing comments, likes, or shares. Its brand remained anchored in solitude, in the idea of putting in your earbuds and vanishing into your own world. But that world was slowly becoming more aware of time, aware of place, aware of mood, and increasingly aware of you. In the next segment, we'll turn from Spotify's product design to its business model, a closer look at how the economics of streaming really work, how artists are paid, and how Spotify balances fairness, scale, and the quiet tension between creativity and capitalism. Let us turn now to a quieter corner of Spotify's world. Not the playlists, not the podcasts, not the algorithms or ambient music, but the system underneath it all, the quiet arithmetic of sound, the economy that keeps the music playing, because every time you press play on a song, a few things happen behind the scenes. Digital packets are delivered, a timestamp is recorded, and somewhere, a fraction of a cent begins its slow journey toward an artist's account. This system, often invisible to the listener, is one of the most debated, least understood aspects of Spotify's existence. Its payout model. Spotify pays rights holders through a system known as pro rata revenue sharing. That means all subscription fees and ad revenue go into a large pool, and each rights holder, whether artist, label, or publisher, gets a share of that pool, proportional to how many times their songs were played. At a glance, this seems logical, but its implications are more complex. Let's say you pay $10 a month for Spotify Premium, and all you listen to is one independent jazz pianist. Under Spotify's model, your subscription doesn't go entirely to that pianist. Instead, it goes into the global pool, which is then divided based on total plays across all users. The jazz pianist, with a small slice of total streams, receives only a sliver of your $10. This model favors the mainstream, the repeatable major pop acts, the ones on today's top hits, on autoplay in gyms and stores, and radio simulcasts, earn more because their songs are streamed more. Smaller, niche artists often see far lower returns, even if they have loyal, dedicated fan bases. Spotify doesn't pay artists directly. It pays rights holders, which could be a label, a distributor, a publisher, or the artists themselves, depending on their contracts. And the per-stream payout, it varies. But Most estimates suggest it's somewhere between $0.003 and $0.005 per stream. That means an artist might need 250,000 to 300,000 streams to earn $1,000. And that's before splits with managers, producers, and labels. This economic model has been a quiet source of tension for years. Artists have spoken out. Some pull their music in protest. Others launch side campaigns, asking fans to support them on platforms like Bandcamp or Patreon. And many continue uploading music anyway, because despite the low payouts, Spotify offers visibility, scale, and discovery. A song buried in obscurity can, in rare cases, be found algorithmically recommended, playlisted, or stumbled upon. Spotify is not a generous benefactor, but it is a powerful stage. In response to criticism, Spotify launched initiatives aimed at transparency and support. One was loud and clear. A microsite launched in 2021 designed to explain the economics of streaming, clarifies Spotify's role, and shared data about earnings and artist tiers. It detailed, for example, how many artists earned over certain thresholds in a given year: $1,000, $10,000, $100,000. The site was not an apology. It was an explanation. Spotify's message was consistent. Streaming economics are complex. Labels, publishers, collecting societies all play a role in how money moves. Spotify doesn't set rates arbitrarily. It negotiates licenses. It distributes what it can. And its margin, despite appearances, remains relatively thin. Still, the feeling persists. The streaming economy is tilted toward scale, toward repetition, toward the big and the constant. In some ways, this reflects not just Spotify's design, but the nature of digital abundance. In the physical era, vinyl CDs, music was scarce. You bought an album, you owned it. Revenue was front-loaded. In streaming, music is limitless. Songs are endless. Value is extracted slowly, one stream at a time, and this has reshaped how music is made. Some artists now craft songs with algorithmic success in mind. Shorter intros, quicker hooks, songs under 3 minutes, optimized for repeat plays, albums with 20 or 30 tracks, designed to maximize total streams, mood music, background music, music that flows easily into other music. There's a quiet irony here. Spotify began as a way to fight piracy to make music accessible, fair, and easy. It succeeded, but in doing so, it changed the economics of creation. Artists still create, but they do so in a world shaped by metadata, metrics, and monetization. And yet, in spite of all this, many musicians still upload their work week after week. They record in bedrooms, mix in headphones, upload via aggregators, and wait. Not because Spotify makes them rich, but because it makes them heard in the next part of our story. We'll explore how Spotify's influence extends not only to sound and economy, but to culture itself, how it shapes musical trends, breaks new artists, and quietly defines what the world hears. Think for a moment about what it means to discover a song today. You don't sift through CDs or tune into a specific radio station. You open your phone, you press play on a curated playlist. The music begins, and you may not even notice the artist's name at first. But the song sticks. You replay it. It slips into your rotation. Slowly, it becomes part of your SOUNDSCAPE. This is how Spotify shapes music, not by dictating taste with volume, but by designing paths of least resistance. And yet, these paths have extraordinary power. Spotify's influence is quiet but vast. It operates through placement, through visibility, and through the slow, subtle logic of algorithms. A song placed at the top of a major playlist will, by default, receive more attention than one hidden 5 scrolls down. A track recommended on autoplay will accrue plays, not because it's better, but because it came next. This power has made Spotify a kind of invisible radio, but instead of a DJ, there are curators, data scientists, and machine learning models, shaping what is heard and when. Spotify doesn't create culture directly. It doesn't record songs or write lyrics, but it has become the infrastructure through which culture is delivered, and so it influences which genres rise to prominence, which songs become hits, which local scenes find international ears. In the late 2010s and early 2020s, Spotify played a significant role in the global spread of Latin pop, K-pop, Afrobeats, and Indian hip-hop, not by marketing them, but by placing them within reach of curious listeners. Tracks that once would have remained regional found themselves next to mainstream Western pop, quietly expanding the palette of global sound. Spotify created special campaigns to support this: Global X, Radar, and Equal Editorial. Programs and playlists designed to spotlight emerging artists, women in music, and international crossovers. Each came with curated exposure, homepage banners, social amplification, small nudges with large effects. For an artist, this kind of placement could mean the difference between anonymity and global attention. And while traditional music media, television, radio, magazines, still plays a role, Spotify's interface is often the first contact between artist and listener. This quiet role, as tastemaker, is both admired and scrutinized. Admired because Spotify can elevate voices that might otherwise be drowned out. It has provided platforms for independent musicians, regional styles, and overlooked genres. It has democratized access to listeners. Scrutinized because it centralizes influence. A handful of editorial decisions or algorithmic outputs shape what hundreds of millions hear. The balance between discovery and repetition becomes delicate. Too much familiarity and diversity shrinks. Too much novelty and engagement drops. Spotify walks this line through feedback loops. It tracks what you play, skip, save, share. It knows if you finish a song, if you repeat a track, if you linger on an artist. This data flows back into its systems, subtly altering what's suggested next, not just for you, but for others with similar behaviors. And so, what begins as personal taste begins to shape collective taste. It's not the only force, of course. TikTok, YouTube, and local music scenes remain powerful, but Spotify's place in this ecosystem is uniquely passive. It doesn't grab your attention, it waits for it. It doesn't push, it presents. And in doing so, it becomes almost invisible. Yet behind this invisibility is structure. Spotify has teams of genre specialists, each with deep familiarity in a musical area. Jazz, grime, techno, indie folk. These aren't generalists. They attend local shows, follow scene trends, and monitor underground shifts. Their curation blends expertise with data, ensuring that playlists remain both authentic and engaging. And then there's the role of the listener, because every person who builds a playlist, shares a track, or posts a song online becomes part of Spotify's cultural engine. The line between artist, listener, and curator has blurred. Everyone, in some small way, participates in shaping the sonic atmosphere of the platform. Spotify's global events, Spotify Wrapped, Spotify Singles, live at Spotify Studios, further reinforce its position. These initiatives offer glimpses behind the music, acoustic versions, spoken word intros, personalized narratives. They humanize sound. They deepen the connection between artist and audience. In some ways, Spotify doesn't just stream music, it archives it, not in the way a library does, but in the way a memory does. Fluid, responsive, and shaped by what comes next. In our next segment, we'll explore how Spotify has sought to redefine itself yet again, not just as a service, but as a tech company, one that sits at the crossroads of audio, data, and a future still being quietly composed. Spotify has always introduced itself as a music platform. That's what the world sees. But beneath the surface, beneath the green logo, the curated playlists, the familiar black interface, lies a different kind of company. A company built more like a software lab than a record label. A company shaped by engineers as much as by artists. Spotify is, at its core, a technology company. It was founded in Stockholm, and that geographical origin matters more than you might think, because Sweden, like much of Scandinavia, has long been a quiet leader in digital infrastructure and design. Its population is small, but deeply online. Broadband penetration is high. Public support for tech education is strong. The culture prizes minimalism, function, and user-centered thinking in this setting. Spotify developed not just as a product, but as a platform philosophy from its earliest days. The engineering team built Spotify with modularity in mind. Unlike many companies that grew into monoliths, Spotify divided itself early on into squads, small, autonomous teams responsible for specific features or services. Each squad had its own mission, timeline, and tools. This structure came to be known as the Spotify model of agile development. It emphasized speed, independence, and iteration. A squad working on playback didn't need to check with a squad working on user profiles. A team designing the Discover Weekly algorithm could experiment freely without waiting for top-down approval. And so, the product evolved rapidly, with different features developing in parallel. This structure became famous in tech circles. Companies from Silicon Valley to Singapore studied it, adapted it, sometimes misapplied it. But at Spotify, it worked. Not because it was perfect, but because it was embedded in a culture that valued both discipline and freedom internally. Spotify invested heavily in machine learning infrastructure. Its recommendation systems, from personalized playlists to suggested podcasts, were supported by vast arrays of user data, behavioral modeling, and neural networks. But the company didn't just build tools. It built tools to build tools. Spotify engineers created frameworks for A/B testing, internal experimentation, and performance monitoring. They developed their own data processing pipelines, their own experimentation platforms, their own in-house machine learning operations tools, tailored specifically to streaming use cases. They also emphasized developer visibility, dashboards, logs, heat maps, crash reports. Spotify wasn't just streaming music. It was constantly watching itself stream music, quietly, patiently, learning where it failed and how to fix it. This culture extended to design. Spotify's interface has always felt restrained. No autoplay videos, no intrusive banners, no bright pop-ups. The color palette is muted, dark mode by default, soft green as an accent. Text is readable. Layouts are consistent. It is designed to fade into the background, to serve the content, not to fight it. That philosophy function over Flash made Spotify's user experience feel almost invisible. But it also meant that when the company did make a change, users noticed. One of the more controversial changes came with the integration of a TikTok-style feed in the browse. Tab, short video previews of music or podcast content. Some users appreciated the interactivity. Others saw it as noise. It reflected Spotify's tension between minimalism and growth. How do you innovate without disrupting the calm? As Spotify matured, it began to see itself less as a product and more as a platform ecosystem. The acquisition of podcast hosting platforms like Anchor and Megaphone signaled a move toward vertical integration. Spotify no longer wanted to just distribute content. It wanted to own the pipes, the tools, and the data. This allowed it to offer creators deeper analytics, monetization tools, and more direct access to audiences. And yet, Spotify didn't abandon its original identity. It still released playful features like blend playlists, where two users' tastes were combined into one. It experimented with lyrics integrations, synced with playback. It rolled out Spotify Canvas, a looping visual element for songs. Quiet animations, nothing too jarring. A hint of motion in a space designed for stillness. In meetings, Spotify leaders often emphasized user journey, not just what the app did, but how it made you feel. Where were you listening? At work, at night, on a walk, on a train. The goal wasn't to entertain, it was to accompany. As the company grew, so did its ambition. It expanded into audiobooks, experimenting with limited access models, licensing, deals, and creator platforms. It explored speech recognition, generative AI, and real-time translation. But unlike many Silicon Valley companies, Spotify rarely moved fast just for speed's sake. Its Scandinavian roots encouraged caution, reflection, and a certain humility. It made mistakes. It retracted features. It revised policies. But it did so softly, quietly adjusting course, without drama. In our next chapter, we'll look outward, at how Spotify's global expansion played out in different regions, the tensions it encountered, and the cultural landscapes it entered. Because while Spotify is one company, it listens in 1,000 languages. Picture Spotify's user interface, the dark background, the soft green highlights, the search bar quietly waiting. Whether you open the app in Berlin, São Paulo, Lagos, or Jakarta, the design is familiar, but what you hear inside is shaped by a very different story. Spotify is a global platform, but it did not become global overnight. Its expansion was strategic, gradual, and deeply attentive to local context. Not just licensing deals and legal requirements, but musical tastes, listening habits, and infrastructure realities. What worked in Sweden would not work unaltered. In South Korea, a playlist designed in London might feel out of place in Buenos Aires. The journey began in Europe. Countries like France, the UK, and Germany were early additions. The infrastructure was similar. Broadband was reliable. Mobile data was increasingly affordable. But even here, Spotify had to navigate complex licensing environments, particularly in Germany, where performance rights laws were stricter than elsewhere. Then came the United States in 2011, a critical market to enter. Spotify had to strike agreements with all major record labels. These negotiations were cautious and slow. The labels had seen what piracy had done in the 2000s, and they were wary of streaming models. But Spotify offered data, transparency, and most importantly, a path forward in a changing landscape. Once inside the US market, Spotify's profile grew rapidly. But global success required more than English language expansion. Spotify began launching in Latin America, Asia, and Africa, each time rethinking parts of its strategy. In many of these markets, data costs were high, smartphone penetration was uneven, and cashless payment systems were limited, so Spotify adapted in India. It introduced a mobile-only subscription tier at a lower cost. It allowed prepaid plans, so users without credit cards could buy access in smaller increments, daily, weekly, or monthly. The catalog was expanded to include regional languages, Hindi, Tamil, Telugu, Punjabi, and more. Playlists were curated, with local holidays and traditions in mind. In Nigeria, Kenya, and South Africa, Spotify focused on growing regional visibility. Playlists like African Heat and Radar Africa spotlighted both emerging and established artists. Editorial teams hired locally ensured that the musical voices represented weren't just imported from the West, but drawn from within. In Japan, the approach was even more nuanced. Japan has long been one of the world's largest physical music markets. CDs remain popular. Streaming adoption was slower than elsewhere. Spotify entered carefully, building partnerships with domestic labels and curating playlists in both Japanese and English. Across all these regions, Spotify kept its interface mostly consistent, familiar, functional, but layered on local curation. And with each new market came new challenges. In some countries, political landscapes affected content availability. Licensing negotiations could stretch for months or years. Cultural sensitivities required thoughtful editorial choices. Some genres, hip-hop in certain regions, religious music in others, required particular care. Spotify's growth strategy also involved partnering with telecom companies. In places where data was expensive, Spotify bundled subscriptions with mobile plans. This allowed users to stream without fear of overage charges, a small shift that made a big difference. It also launched Spotify Lite, a lighter version of the app designed for phones with limited storage or slower networks. It offered essential features, search, playback, playlists, while consuming less data and battery. Designed originally for markets like India, Indonesia, and Brazil, it demonstrated Spotify's quiet flexibility. And then there was localization. Beyond language, the deeper kind in Brazil. For example, Spotify leaned into funk karaoke and sertanejo. In Indonesia, it elevated dangdut and indie pop. In the Philippines, OPM, original Filipino music, found a stronger home through curated promotion. In each market, the goal was not to impose global taste, but to reflect and support local sound. Spotify understood that music is both global and deeply local, a platform that ignored that would remain a foreign service, but one that adapted, gently, respectfully, could become part of the cultural fabric. One playlist might introduce a South Korean listener to Nigerian Afrobeat. Another might help a Canadian user discover Egyptian trap. This wasn't just about expansion, it was about connection, softly threading together listeners through shared emotion, rhythm, and sound. And behind all of it, the interface remained quiet. No flags, no borders, just a scrollable grid of sound, curated and personalized in hundreds of subtle variations. In our next part, will reflect on the quiet but growing tension at the heart of Spotify's identity, between platform and publisher, between neutrality and influence. A company that simply plays music, and one that decides what gets played. Spotify has long positioned itself as a platform, a neutral space where artists upload, listeners choose, and algorithms gently guide. But as the company grew, as its curation deepened and its exclusives expanded, the line between platform and publisher began to blur. This shift didn't come all at once. It unfolded gradually through a series of decisions that at first seemed technical, then editorial, and eventually ethical. A key moment came with Spotify originals, exclusive podcasts created or acquired by the company itself. Shows like The Joe Rogan Experience, Call Her Daddy, and Renegades, born in the USA, marked Spotify's entry into the realm of owned content. Unlike music, which flowed from external rights holders, these podcasts were internal assets, funded, promoted, and controlled by Spotify. With ownership came questions of responsibility when a controversial episode aired, or a guest made polarizing claims. Listeners no longer viewed Spotify as a passive distributor. They began to ask, does Spotify endorse this? Why is this being promoted? Why is this still online? These weren't just questions of taste. They were questions of editorial judgment. Spotify responded cautiously. It upheld the importance of free expression while also introducing content advisories for sensitive topics, like COVID-19. It didn't remove most episodes, but it signaled awareness, a quiet shift in tone from neutrality toward curation. With oversight, this shift wasn't limited to podcasts. Even in music, Spotify's editorial playlists, like Rap Caviar, Mint, or R&B, had become so influential that their selections carried weight. Artists publicly celebrated being added to a list. Others voiced frustration when overlooked. The playlists weren't just reflective, they were constructive. They helped make careers. Internally, Spotify maintained a careful distinction. The algorithm is personalized. The playlists are curated. The company doesn't produce most of the content it hosts. It builds tools, it distributes, it recommends, but in the public eye, that line grew thinner. Spotify's move into advertising further complicated this. Through tools like streaming ad insertion SI, podcast creators could monetize their shows more precisely. But with advertising came metrics, and with metrics came expectations about audience, engagement, and tone. Spotify began offering creator dashboards, showing how episodes performed, who was listening, and what was working, helpful for growth. Yes, but also subtly shaping what creators produced. Over time, these tools began to influence content indirectly, and so the platform shaped the publisher, and the publisher shaped the platform. This wasn't a conspiracy. It was a pattern. A platform at scale inevitably makes decisions, not just technical ones, but human ones. Spotify faced pressure from multiple sides. Artists demanded more transparency. Listeners asked for clearer moderation policies. Rights organizations called for fairer payouts. Advertisers requested brand safety. The company responded not with sweeping changes, but with quiet shifts, policy updates, dashboard improvements, transparency reports. It never declared itself a publisher, but it no longer appeared to be a simple conduit either. This in-between space is Spotify's reality. It is not a broadcaster. It is not a newspaper. It is not a record label. But it is also not passive. It chooses what to promote. It recommends. It shapes taste and conversation. And in that role, Spotify is not alone. All platforms that deal with content, YouTube, Chikitoki, Instagram, face this same tension. But Spotify's tone is different. It does not shout. It does not provoke. It curates quietly, almost invisibly. Even when it removed episodes or adjusted policies, it rarely issued public statements. It updated help pages. It sent emails to creators. It adjusted search results. The voice was always low, measured, and careful. This posture reflects not just brand strategy, but cultural origin. Scandinavian companies tend toward understatement, restraint, and long-term trust. Spotify's leadership avoided loud gestures. It favored slow trust-building. Still, the questions linger. Is Spotify a mirror of what people want, or a designer of what they hear? Is it fair to expect neutrality in a world where recommendation itself is an influence? These questions have no final answer. They evolve as Spotify does, through its features, policies, partnerships, and presence. And in our final main segment, we'll reflect on where Spotify stands now, a company that began with a quiet mission to fight piracy, and now finds itself shaping the way the world listens, learns, and even thinks in audio. As we come toward the quieter end of this long journey, we settle in the present, a moment still in motion, still unfinished. Spotify, once a small Stockholm-based startup, now stands as one of the most recognizable digital brands on Earth. But what, exactly, is it now? The company itself still calls Spotify a music streaming service. But the truth is, it has become an audio company, and more subtly, a cultural utility. You may not think of it each time you open the app. You may not even look at the screen, but it's there in your routine, in your environment, in your atmosphere. As of the mid-2020s, Spotify boasts over 600 million users worldwide, with more than 250 million paying subscribers. These numbers place it at the forefront of digital media, a position built not just on content, but on consistency, interface familiarity, and passive use. People use Spotify while walking, working, studying, or sleeping. It doesn't demand your eyes. It doesn't interrupt. And that, perhaps, is its greatest strength. It fits into time, gently, and often without announcement. Spotify's core focus remains on three main audio pillars: music, podcasts, and audiobooks. Each one presents unique opportunities and challenges. In music, the platform continues to battle for margin. Record label agreements are complex. Royalty structures are under pressure. New models, like the fan-powered approach used by SoundCloud, are being discussed. Spotify has responded with transparency initiatives, artist dashboards, and feature enhancements to help creators connect directly with fans. In podcasting, Spotify's bet has matured. After years of investing in exclusive content, the platform has shifted again from acquisition to platform tooling. It now focuses more on hosting, monetization, infrastructure, and discovery, trying to become the default place for creators, not just listeners. Some exclusives remain, but Spotify learned that ownership isn't always more valuable than scale. The company pivoted toward an open approach, allowing creators to reach listeners on multiple platforms while using Spotify tools behind the scenes. With audiobooks, Spotify is exploring the edges of what audio consumption looks like. The launch of audiobooks into premium accounts marked a new chapter, one where Spotify gently edges into Amazon and Audible's territory. Still limited in some countries, This experiment suggests that Spotify sees listening time as flexible and content categories as fluid. Across all of this, Spotify quietly continues to build its personalization engine, a system that feels increasingly intimate. The app knows if you tend to listen in the morning or at night, if you prefer lyric ballads or instrumental lo-fi, if you pause halfway through songs or listen all the way through. It doesn't use this to manipulate. It uses it to adjust, softly, quietly. And then there are the wrapped campaigns. Each December, Spotify releases personalized summaries for each user, their most played artists, genres, songs, and minutes listened. These aren't just fun infographics. They are identity rituals, shared online, discussed among friends, compared and laughed about. It's a gentle act of collective reflection, and, perhaps more surprisingly, Spotify has found its way into wellness and education. Sleep playlists, guided meditations, language learning podcasts, soundscapes for focus. The platform now serves listeners not only as entertainment, but as a kind of ambient support system, something that lives beside you, not in front of you, even with competitors. Rising, Apple Music, YouTube Music, Amazon, regional services, Spotify holds its place, not by locking users in, but by making it easy to stay. Its challenges persist: profitability, licensing tensions, regional regulation, content moderation. But it moves steadily, quietly, not with shocking reinventions, but with careful iterations. It does not seek to be everything, just one thing, done well, a place where audio can live and listeners can return, again and again, without fanfare. In the next segment, our final main segment, we'll explore the contrasting lives of those at Spotify's helm, from founders and engineers to curators and artists, the people who shaped this system and the ones still guiding it, largely behind the scenes. While Spotify as a company is often symbolized by its app, its playlists, and its green logo, the real story of its success is, as always, a human one. Not dramatic, not sensational, but careful, steady, and quietly determined. Let's begin with its co-founder and longtime public face, Daniel Ek. Daniel was never a flamboyant executive. His demeanor was, and still is, measured a little. Private, a little reserved. He doesn't command headlines in the style of Silicon Valley's louder personalities. Instead, he's always seemed more focused on long-term vision than on performance theater. Born in 1983 in Stockholm, Ek began his life in modest surroundings. He was a child of the internet's early years, and by the age of 14, he was already building websites. Not glamorous projects, simple pages for local clients, often for very little pay. He would later say he charged the equivalent of just a few dollars an hour at first. But he learned, and quickly. By the time he was in his early 20s, he had already worked at several tech companies. His ambition was never merely wealth. It was impact through design. He believed in making something people could use every day without friction. Spotify grew out of that belief, and his response to piracy, to music's digital chaos in the mid-2000s, wasn't moral outrage. It was calm problem-solving. He often remarked that people pirated music not because they wanted to steal, but because the legal experience was worse. So he sought to build a product that was better. His partnership with Martin Lorentzen, the co-founder who brought funding and a strong business instinct, gave Spotify its foundation. Martin, more gregarious and business-oriented, complemented Daniel's product-focused thinking. The two disagreed often, but always within the quiet culture of Swedish corporate decorum, direct, but never explosive. As Spotify grew, the team around them became a rotating ensemble of quiet builders, engineers, designers, and data scientists who worked in small squads, often without recognition. They weren't chasing fame. Most of them didn't seek interviews or public accolades. They were focused on infrastructure, making the servers faster, the recommendations smoother, the app more intuitive. Many came from other Swedish or Nordic companies, Ericsson, Skype, Klarna, bringing with them a specific Scandinavian mindset, restrained, practical, deeply committed to functionality. Then there were the editors and curators, the ones who built playlists, tracked trends, and surfaced new voices. These individuals weren't always technologists. Some were former radio programmers, some were journalists, some were just fans, deeply knowledgeable in one genre or region. They worked in silence, building trust with artists, assembling sounds that made millions of users feel understood. Their work was not visible in a splashy way. It existed in the track order of today's top hits, in the subtle sequencing of your favorite coffee house, in the discovery of a new artist that felt personal, even though millions of others were finding them at the same time. And then there were the artists themselves. Some came with massive followings. Others uploaded their first track through Spotify for artists, watching in quiet wonder as their play counts climbed. The company didn't make these creators, but it gave them a place to be heard, sometimes unexpectedly, sometimes virally, sometimes slowly. Spotify's artist support team worked behind the scenes to offer workshops, data access, feedback channels. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was essential, a quiet link between engineering and art. Also, crucial were the regional leads, Spotify's local country teams. In markets like India, Brazil, South Korea, Nigeria, and beyond, these individuals translated not just language, but culture. They decided which songs to push, which playlists to highlight, how to speak in a voice that felt native, not global. And throughout it all, Spotify remained relatively modest in its physical presence. No sprawling campuses, no bombastic keynote presentations, just offices in key cities, designed to feel like calm workspaces, not tech temples. The leadership rarely celebrated itself. When milestones were hit, -100 million users, 1 billion playlists, 80 countries launched, they acknowledged them without fanfare, because, for Spotify, celebration was never the goal. Sustainability was endurance, quiet improvement, and today, while most of the world listens to Spotify without thinking of its makers, those makers still build, still refine, still listen. They listen not just to the music, but to the system itself, how it's working, where it's failing, and what it might become next. In our final segment, we'll take a step back and reflect on Spotify's broader legacy, not as a disruptor or a giant, but as something quieter, a companion to the modern world, reshaping not just how we listen, but how we live with sound. As we near the end of this long and unhurried story, we step back from the internal workings, the negotiations, the features, the names. We let the details settle, and we simply consider the shape of what Spotify has become, not as a company, but as a presence. Spotify does not dominate attention in the way social media does. It does not flash, it does not vibrate with urgency, and yet it is everywhere, playing in kitchens, humming through earbuds, reverberating from cars in the rain. It is ambient, It is quiet. It is nearly invisible, a background technology that, like electricity or plumbing, becomes most noticeable only when it is gone. And that might be its truest legacy. Before Spotify, music consumption was fragmented. People downloaded, ripped, borrowed. They organized folders, burned CDs, updated iPods. Music was active, a thing you managed. After Spotify, it became passive, persistent, always available. A layer of life. Spotify did not invent this shift, but it refined it, made it smooth, legal, shareable, and most importantly, habitual. In the same way that Google became the instinct for information, or that email became the instinct for communication, Spotify became the instinct for sound. Wake up, open Spotify, a podcast to start the morning, a playlist for the walk, a focus track for work, something relaxing for the evening. The rhythm of the day arranged gently in tracks and episodes, gliding between moments. This transformation is subtle. You may not notice it happening. You may not even call it Spotify. You might say you're just listening to music. But underneath that simplicity is a complex system designed, maintained, adjusted daily by hundreds of quiet minds. Spotify does not push itself into your consciousness. It waits, it suggests, it welcomes you back. It learns, not in a way that feels invasive, but in a way that simply says, here. This might fit today, and for many users, it does. But this presence also comes with a kind of responsibility, one that Spotify has acknowledged more and more over the years. Because to shape listening is, in a soft way, to shape mood, productivity, discovery, even identity. The company has invested in mental health playlists, LGBTQ+ audio hubs, regional artist showcases, and educational partnerships. Small actions, quiet signals, a nod, not a shout. It has also quietly become a lens through which history is preserved. Rare recordings, oral storytelling, decades of musical eras, all available in a scroll, not sorted by museum curators, but by machine-learned tags and listener patterns. Spotify is not an archive, but it is where the archive is heard. And this, too, may be its legacy, not only as a tool of the present, but as a bridge between generations of sound. A place where a teenager might stumble across an old jazz recording, where a listener in Ghana might discover ambient Icelandic electronica, where music is not contained by geography or era, but allowed to flow, quietly, softly, always on. Spotify may never be the loudest tech company. It likely won't lead headlines. But it has entered the intimate texture of daily life, as routine as brushing teeth, as natural as glancing out a window. Its power is not in volume, but in presence. It is always there, just under the surface, sound without disruption. And in that way, Spotify does what only a few technologies ever do. It becomes invisible by becoming essential. It becomes the silence between songs, the rhythm of morning and night. And for now, it continues, building quietly, listening to dot. Thank you for joining this calm and winding journey through the creation and quiet influence of Spotify. As you drift off, remember, not all history is made by the loudest voices. Some of it hums gently in the background, always playing, never ending. Good night.